In the summer of 1942, the tide of the Pacific War stood on the edge of a vast and silent turning. 8 months had passed since Japan's stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, the strike that had plunged the Pacific into flames and crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Across the empire, banners still hung in triumphal colors. From the jungles of Burma to the reefs of the Solomons, Japan's red sun seemed to rise over every horizon. Yet, beneath that outward brilliance, the inner machinery of Japan's war effort was beginning to tremble. The victories of early 1942 had been swift but shallow. Japanese forces had captured territory on a scale that even their own planners had not foreseen. Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, but the very reach of that success stretched Japan's logistics to breaking. Oil tankers were thinly protected, airfields hastily built, and garrisons scattered across a map that now spanned 6,000 miles. In Tokyo, the naval staff under Admiral Osami Nagano still believed they could consolidate this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But inside the fleet, the admirals who had commanded at Pearl Harbor, Isoroku Yamamoto, Chuichi Nagumo, and Nobutake Kondo, were beginning to see a different reality. The war had not ended with the blow at Pearl Harbor. It had only awakened an enemy whose industrial power was now stirring at full force. The warning signs had come quickly. In April, American carrier raids under Jimmy Doolittle had reached Tokyo itself, a psychological wound that cut deep into the Japanese high command. In May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese forces failed to capture Port Moresby. And in June came the decisive rupture, the Battle of Midway. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost within hours. Hundreds of elite aviators perished, and with them, the irreplaceable heart of Japan's naval air power. In the aftermath, Japanese naval staff reports spoke of the losses as temporary. But in private, the tone was darker. Yamamoto himself is recorded as saying, "The fruits of victory are tumbling into our mouths too quickly." The offensive momentum that had begun at Pearl Harbor was bleeding away, replaced by a fragile effort to hold what they had gained. By early August 1942, Japanese intelligence noted unusual American naval movements in the South Pacific. The Imperial Navy's 8th Fleet, based at Rabaul, received scattered reconnaissance of Allied transports moving toward the Solomon Islands. At first, these were dismissed as minor raids, perhaps an attempt to test Japan's outer perimeter. But in the days leading up to August 6th, the pattern grew unmistakable. Carrier groups, troop convoys, and long-range bombers were converging around a small, obscure island called Guadalcanal. The island itself had little value on paper, a jungle-covered strip of volcanic earth. Yet on its northern coast, Japanese engineers had begun constructing an airfield, one that could threaten the vital sea route between the United States and Australia. For the Americans, seizing it was a necessity. For the Japanese, losing it would mean their defensive line in the South Pacific was fatally breached. As night fell on August 6th, Japanese commanders aboard their ships in Truk, Rabaul, and Tokyo's naval general staff could not yet see the scale of what was coming. But the signs were there, unmistakable to the few who understood how war economies worked. Oil stocks were dwindling. Aircraft production was lagging. The once mighty carrier force was now half its size, its pilots replaced by rushed trainees. The empire still appeared strong, but its naval backbone was hollowing from within. For the first time, Japan's admirals began to grasp that the war they had unleashed at Pearl Harbor could not be sustained, not against an enemy whose factories and shipyards were now operating around the clock. August 6, 1942. One day before the first American Marines landed on Guadalcanal marked a quiet turning point. In Tokyo's war rooms, maps still showed an empire at its greatest extent. But in the Pacific's dark waters, fate was already shifting. The offensive born at Pearl Harbor was over. From this moment forward, Japan's Navy would be forced to fight a war it had never prepared to fight, a defensive one. In the first half of 1942, Japan's naval aviation had seemed untouchable. Its carrier strike groups, forged through years of rigorous pre-war training, executed long-range operations with mathematical precision. Yet by August, this tactical edge was fading. Midway had destroyed not just 4 carriers, but hundreds of Japan's best pilots. Men trained through a system that emphasized mastery over quantity. Their replacements, hastily schooled and barely combat-ready, were being sent into war faster than aircraft could be built for them. American technology, once derided in Tokyo as crude and mass-produced, was quietly advancing. The new F-4F Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers were being fielded in greater numbers, supported by a radar network and early warning systems Japan lacked entirely. While Japanese carrier groups still relied on human observation and long-distance seaplane patrols, U.S. forces were beginning to integrate radar intercepts into naval tactics, allowing them to anticipate attacks before the first bomb fell. The gap widened at sea. Japan's torpedoes, the famed Long Lance, remained deadly, but they could not compensate for an increasingly fragmented command structure. Radio discipline, once a strength, was breaking down as operations spread across thousands of miles. Naval planners who had once choreographed precision strikes now found themselves reacting to scattered intelligence and uncoordinated orders. In August 1942, as Japan prepared to respond to the Allied landings on Guadalcanal, its fleet looked formidable on paper. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers still outnumbered the enemy in tonnage and gunpowder. Yet the unseen truth was that Japan's tactical system, built around offense, was mismatched to the defensive battles now awaiting it. It had no doctrine for long-term attrition, no mechanism for systematic replenishment. Beneath the surface of triumph, Japan's naval machine had become what one post-war analyst called a blade too finely honed. Brilliant in the strike, brittle in the endurance. The mood among Japan's naval officers in the weeks after Midway was one of restrained anxiety, carefully hidden beneath layers of formality. To the public, communiques still spoke of strategic withdrawals and adjustments. But within fleet headquarters, the loss of the carriers and their aviators was felt as a wound to the spirit. For many officers who had believed in the moral invincibility of the Imperial Navy, the realization was disorienting. Japan's naval ethos, Seishin, placed faith in courage and willpower as forces capable of overcoming material inferiority. The idea had guided every major operation since Pearl Harbor. But by August 1942, the men charged with carrying out those operations were confronting a new truth. Spirit could not replace fuel, training, or air cover. Letters and diaries later recovered from officers stationed in Rabaul and Truk reveal an undercurrent of unease. One lieutenant described a growing silence among the men. Not fear, but a dawning awareness that they were fighting on borrowed strength. Reports of American aircraft production were dismissed publicly, but privately, they circulated among staff officers who knew what they meant. Among younger pilots, morale began to fracture along generational lines. Veterans of the early campaigns regarded their replacements as untested, while the new recruits, barely out of flight school, saw the veterans as fatalists. The Imperial Navy's once elite culture of precision and unity began to fray. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto himself, the architect of Pearl Harbor, retreated into an increasingly solitary command role. Though still outwardly confident, he was acutely aware that Japan's resources could not sustain a prolonged war. By the first week of August, his private memoranda reflected a tone of quiet foreboding. The Navy's outward face remained disciplined, but internally, its officers were beginning to grasp the unspoken. The war had reached its high water mark, and the tide was already falling. The strategic crisis of mid-1942 exposed deep divisions within Japan's military leadership, divisions that had existed long before Pearl Harbor but had been masked by early victories. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army operated as largely independent entities, each with its own hierarchy, objectives, and logistical systems. Cooperation was limited, often hostile. At the top of the naval command, Yamamoto faced an impossible dilemma. His instinct was to preserve what remained of the carrier fleet for decisive engagements, to lure the Americans into one last crushing battle. But Tokyo's Army General Staff demanded continued offensives to secure the Empire's perimeter. Each service pursued its own vision of victory, with little coordination beyond the Emperor's symbolic oversight. This disunity reached critical levels by August 1942. When intelligence reported American convoys heading toward the Solomons, the Army dismissed the threat as minor. The Navy, overstretched and underinformed, struggled to react swiftly. Even as U.S. Marines were embarking for Guadalcanal, Japan's high command was still debating whether the enemy's target was New Guinea, Rabaul, or even the Marshall Islands. The confusion illustrated a fatal flaw in Japan's command structure. It was designed for rapid conquest, not defense. Once forced onto the back foot, its mechanisms for decision-making slowed to paralysis. Direct orders required imperial approval, and rivalry between branches delayed every response. In contrast, the American system, decentralized and adaptive, was learning from its early defeats. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, encouraged initiative among subordinates like Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy had already institutionalized lessons Japan had not yet acknowledged. By the time Yamamoto realized the true purpose of the Allied buildup in the Solomons, the American landings were only hours away. The Empire's admirals had the authority to win battles, but not the flexibility to win a changing war. Pearl Harbor had been conceived as a preemptive strike, an act meant to cripple American resolve and secure a quick diplomatic settlement. Instead, it guaranteed a total war. By August 1942, this reality was becoming undeniable. Japan's leadership had assumed that the United States, once dealt a shocking blow, would seek negotiation rather than mobilization. Instead, industrial mobilization had reached levels Japan could not imagine. In a single month, American shipyards were producing more tonnage than Japan could replace in a year. Aircraft assembly lines in California and Kansas were now running around the clock. For Japanese strategists, this imbalance carried moral weight as well as material consequence. Their entire conception of warfare, based on the ideal of the decisive battle, was proving obsolete against an opponent whose power came not from brilliance in combat, but from endurance and production. This realization did not come with speeches or declarations. It came in data sheets, loss reports, and unanswered requisitions. It came when fuel convoys failed to arrive, when air wings went into battle with half-trained crews, when islands once captured with pride became isolated outposts waiting for relief that never came. The moral impact of that recognition that Pearl Harbor had not ended America's will but awakened it was immense. It was the quiet, devastating moment when Japan's admirals understood that victory had turned into entrapment. The empire had expanded too far, too fast, and now stood suspended between pride and inevitability. By August 6, 1942, the truth hung silently over the maps in every naval command, room from Rabaul to Tokyo. The empire's fate was not yet sealed, but the men who had once believed they were shaping history were beginning to sense that history was now shaping them. In the pre-dawn hours of August 7, 1942, one day after that, quiet August 6th evening, the calm of the Ihur, Lower Solomon Islands broke under the thunder of naval guns. From the decks of U.S. carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, Waves of aircraft struck the small Japanese-held island of Guadalcanal. Behind them, nearly 11,000 Marines prepared to land, the first large-scale Allied amphibious assault of the Pacific War. For Japan's Imperial Navy, the blow was as unexpected as it was devastating. Only weeks earlier, Japanese engineers had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast, near Lunga Point. It was meant to serve as a forward base to cut off Allied shipping routes to Australia, a cornerstone in Japan's plan to isolate the continent and force the Western powers into negotiation. Its loss, therefore, carried consequences beyond the tactical. It struck at the entire logic of Japan's Pacific perimeter. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding Japan's 8th Fleet from Rabaul, was among the first to grasp the scale of the crisis. His available surface ships, a mix of cruisers and destroyers, were scattered across the Bismarck archipelago. No carriers were immediately on hand. The nearest air support lay over 600 miles away. Yet within hours of hearing reports of American landings, Mikawa ordered every available ship to assemble at full speed for a night counterattack. The response revealed both Japan's brilliance and its desperation. Mikawa's squadron, 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, departed Rabaul on August 8th, steaming south through the dark waters of the slot. Their mission: strike the Allied invasion fleet at anchor off Guadalcanal and destroy its transports before sunrise. It was a daring maneuver, carried out without air reconnaissance and with almost no communication to Tokyo. That night, under heavy cloud and without radar, Mikawa's ships slipped undetected into the waters north of Savo Island. There, in the early hours of August 9th, they found the Allied covering force, a mix of American and Australian cruisers, lying at anchor in 2 loose groups. What followed was one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the war. Japanese lookouts spotted silhouettes first. Firing torpedoes and shells in rapid succession, Mikawa's cruisers turned the anchorage into chaos. The Allied ships, Canberra, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, were sunk in under an hour. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died before dawn. When Mikawa withdrew at 2:00 a.m., he had achieved a tactical masterpiece, but even in victory lay the seeds of disaster. Though his force could have pressed forward to attack the unprotected American transports, Mikawa chose to retreat, fearing daylight airstrikes from the U.S. carriers he believed still nearby. His decision spared his fleet, but it also spared the American invasion. By sunrise, Guadalcanal remained in Allied hands. On paper, Japan had won the Battle of Savo Island. In reality, it had failed to achieve its objective. The airfield at Lunga Point, soon renamed Henderson Field, stayed under American control. Within days, Marine engineers had completed its runway, and the first American fighters began operating from it. From that moment on, every Japanese ship, plane, or troop transport approaching the Solomons would come under constant threat. In Tokyo, the initial reports were confusing. The Navy announced a great victory off Savo Island, but the fine print, that the American landings had not been repelled, carried darker implications. Admiral Yamamoto, reading the after-action summaries aboard his flagship Yamato, understood immediately. The Empire had reached its limit. The strike at Pearl Harbor had been designed to destroy America's ability to project power. Yet less than a year later, American forces had crossed the Pacific and landed on territory Japan still claimed as its own. The defensive line Japan had built from the Kuriles to the Solomons was now breached. The psychological impact within the Japanese Navy was profound. Guadalcanal was no longer a remote island. It was a mirror. It reflected back to Japan everything that had gone wrong: the overextension, the flawed assumptions, the exhaustion of resources. For the admirals who had once believed the Empire could dictate the tempo of war, it was the moment they realized they were no longer leading events. They were reacting to them. By mid-August, The Japanese Navy began to plan its counteroffensive to retake Guadalcanal. But deep inside the operational reports and coded transmissions, a subtle change in language appeared. The phrase offensive expansion disappeared from planning documents. In its place came a new word: containment. The Pacific War's direction had shifted. What had begun as Japan's campaign of dominance was now, inevitably, a campaign of survival. By late August 1942, both sides understood that the struggle for the island would decide control of the South Pacific. For Japan, it became an obsession. The belief that retaking Guadalcanal was essential to restoring the empire's prestige and preventing an Allied advance toward Rabaul. But the cost of that belief soon proved ruinous. Night after night, Japanese destroyers made the 560-mile run from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, ferrying troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. It was a desperate improvisation. Small ships, overloaded with men and crates of ammunition, forced to withdraw before daylight to avoid the relentless air patrols from Henderson Field. Thousands of soldiers arrived without heavy weapons, food, or medical equipment. Many would die before ever engaging the enemy. For the Imperial Navy, every resupply mission drained irreplaceable resources. Fuel stocks dwindled, engines overheated, and with every passing week, the balance of power in the air tilted further toward the Americans. From Henderson Field, U.S. Marine and Navy pilots could strike at Japanese convoys the moment dawn broke. What began as a tactical advantage became a relentless cycle of attrition. At sea, Japan launched repeated counteroffensives to drive the U.S. Navy away. At the battles of the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and later the naval engagements around Iron Bottom Sound. These were fierce, often chaotic battles fought at close range in tropical darkness, where radar-directed American gunfire met the torpedo salvos of Japanese destroyers. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but Japan's were catastrophic in proportion. Its veteran carrier pilots, the survivors of Pearl Harbor and Midway, were killed faster than they could be replaced. The few new carriers launched in 1943 sailed with half-trained air groups. Inside Japan's naval headquarters, reports became increasingly coded, almost euphemistic. Losses were described as temporary setbacks. Fuel shortages were called adjustments of operations. Yet the truth was unmistakable. The Empire's naval lifeline was collapsing. The combined effect of combat losses, logistics failures, and dwindling air cover made sustained operations impossible. By November 1942, the strain reached its peak. In the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over several nights between November 12th and 15th, both sides committed everything they had left. Japan sent battleships Hiei and Kirishima to bombard Henderson Field, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. In brutal close-range fighting, illuminated by burning ships, both were sunk. American losses were also severe, but U.S. shipyards replaced their vessels within months. Japan's shipyards could not replace even one. The contrast became stark. Each Japanese defeat carried strategic permanence. Each American loss was temporary. The Pacific balance, once delicately poised, began to tilt irreversibly westward. By February 1943, after 6 months of futile fighting, Japan ordered the evacuation of Guadalcanal. It was a rare admission of defeat, carried out under darkness and silence, extracting what remained of the 17th Army by destroyer. When the final troops departed on February 7th, the island that had consumed so much of Japan's strength was left behind. In Tokyo, the mood was subdued, almost ceremonial. Publicly, the withdrawal was described as a successful repositioning. Privately, Yamamoto and his staff knew what it meant. Guadalcanal had been the hinge of the Pacific War, the moment the offensive dream born at Pearl Harbor ended. For Japan's admirals, August 6, 1942, had marked the beginning of that realization. February 1943 confirmed it beyond doubt. The empire that had once defined itself through attack now faced a future defined by endurance. Every battle fought after Guadalcanal, in the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, would trace its origins to this loss. The consequences extended beyond strategy. They reached into morale, leadership, and even faith. The men who had planned Pearl Harbor began to question not their courage, but their premise, that Japan could win a total industrial war against a nation like the United States. From that point onward, the Japanese Navy's story would be one of contraction, not expansion. Its fleets would never again advance into enemy waters with the same confidence. The tide that had begun to turn on that quiet evening of August 6, 1942, was now fully in motion, a tide no admiral could reverse. The fall of Guadalcanal in early 1943 marked far more than the loss of a single island. It signaled the irreversible shift from Japan's offensive empire to its defensive struggle for survival. From that point forward, the Pacific War would be measured not by how far Japan could advance, but by how long it could endure. The Imperial Japanese Navy emerged from the campaign hollowed in both strength and confidence. 6 months of continuous battle had destroyed much of its veteran corps. Aviators, destroyer captains, and staff officers trained through years of discipline and experience. What remained was a navy that still looked powerful on paper, but was strategically crippled. Fuel shortages had become chronic. The oil once captured in the Dutch East Indies could no longer reach Japan safely, as Allied submarines and aircraft tightened their control of sea lanes. Every major sortie required months of rationing and risk. Japan's shipyards could not replace the lost destroyers, cruisers, or carriers at a rate that mattered. Even aircraft production, which the government had tried to expand, suffered from shortages of aluminum and skilled labor. By contrast, the United States was accelerating into total mobilization. The industrial response unleashed after Pearl Harbor was now visible in full scale. Shipyards on the West Coast launching a new aircraft carrier every few months. Factories in Detroit and Seattle producing planes faster than Japan could train pilots to face them. In 1942, the U.S. Navy had fewer than a dozen fleet carriers. By the end of 1943, it would have more than 30. This disparity transformed the nature of the war. Japan's strategy, built on the notion of a single decisive battle that would force American negotiation, was no longer feasible. The Pacific would now be fought as a continuous sequence of attritional advances, a kind of industrial momentum that Japan could not stop. For Japan's admirals, this realization was deeply personal. Many of them had studied in the United States before the war. Admiral Yamamoto himself had served as a naval attaché in Washington, where he had seen America's industrial power firsthand. He had warned Tokyo's leadership that Japan could win only if the war were short and decisive. Yet, by August 1942, the very opposite had occurred. In the aftermath of Guadalcanal, Yamamoto's tone changed. In staff meetings and correspondence, he spoke less of victory and more of duty. The duty to defend the empire's remaining holdings for as long as possible. His once ambitious plans for further offensives were replaced by directives for prolonged resistance. Within a year, he would be dead, shot down by American aircraft over Bougainville in April 1943. His death symbolized the passing of the generation that had conceived Japan's Pacific strategy. On the Allied side, Guadalcanal became proof that the initiative could be seized, that the Japanese Navy, once feared as invincible, could be beaten through endurance and coordination. It was a hard, grinding campaign that reshaped Allied strategy. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps refined their amphibious doctrine, their logistics systems, and their command integration. By the time of the Central Pacific offensives in 1944, those lessons would form the backbone of a methodical advance that reached all the way to the Marianas and the Philippines. The psychological aftermath within Japan was quieter, but no less significant. Newspapers spoke of fierce fighting and strategic repositioning, but rumors spread among the public that Guadalcanal had been a defeat. For the first time since the war began, the idea of inevitable victory began to fade. Officers returning from the Solomons described scenes of exhaustion and loss that no censorship could entirely conceal. By the end of 1943, Japan's entire perimeter, from the Aleutians to New Guinea, was under pressure. The empire's naval staff meetings became dominated by defensive planning: how to conserve aircraft, how to protect fuel, how to delay the inevitable. The expansionist vision that had driven the war since 1941 had collapsed into crisis management. Looking back, Japanese naval historian Masanori Ito would later write, "Guadalcanal was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end." That judgment captures the truth Japan's admirals began to understand on August 6, 1942, that the Empire's grand gamble at Pearl Harbor had failed not in its execution, but in its conception. The attack had awakened an enemy that could not be intimidated, and the war that followed would consume the very forces that began it. By the time the last Japanese troops withdrew from Guadalcanal, the illusion of control was gone. From Tokyo's war rooms to the bridges of its remaining carriers, the recognition spread quietly, almost solemnly. The Pacific was no longer theirs to shape. It now belonged to the side that could endure, rebuild, and adapt. And that side was no longer Japan. By the time the smoke had cleared from Guadalcanal's jungles, the Pacific had entered a new age of war. The great fleets that had once defined naval power, battleships, cruisers, carriers, still sailed. But the meaning of victory had changed. No longer could a single strike, no matter how daring, decide the outcome. The Pacific War had become a contest of systems, of industry, of endurance. For Japan, this transformation was devastating precisely because it had been invisible at first. The admirals who planned Pearl Harbor had believed war could still be won through audacity, that a fleet, perfectly trained and guided by discipline and courage, could overcome material inferiority. And for a moment, they were right. But as 1942 unfolded, they discovered that courage, precision, and even tactical brilliance could not outweigh geography. Production and time, August 6, 1942, stands as the moment that realization began to crystallize. It was the quiet turning before the storm, when Japan's naval command, still reeling from Midway, began to see the shape of the future approaching from across the Pacific. In that stillness before Guadalcanal, the admirals who had once celebrated Pearl Harbor understood what they had truly unleashed: a war that Japan could begin, but not finish. The consequences reached beyond the Pacific. They marked the beginning of a global shift in warfare itself, from limited campaigns of maneuver to total wars sustained by industrial and logistical depth. The United States would carry this model to its full expression, while Japan, unable to match its scale, would watch its empire recede island by island, mile by mile. When historians look back at the Pacific War, they often name Midway as the decisive battle. Yet in truth, the recognition of defeat began earlier, in the quiet awareness of men who understood the numbers, who saw their supply charts thinning and their pilot rosters shrinking. August 6, 1942, was not a battle, nor a declaration, but an awakening. On that day, Japan's admirals knew what history would take years to prove: that Pearl Harbor, for all its brilliance, had been the Empire's fatal mistake.